Welcome to another episode of the Connecting Through Technology podcast powered by Intellacall. I'm your host, Jonathan Kaur, and today I have the privilege of speaking to Dave Shaby, the Chief Operating Officer at Reenergize Group. Dave is a sales and marketing leader with 25 years of experience driving sales initiatives, creating new revenue centers, training thousands of sellers and marketers, and helping clients achieve their goals. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. Thanks for that nice intro.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, let's kick this off. Right now we're in the middle of what seems to be an elephant in the room with every conversation, this global pandemic that we're going through. And to kick off this conversation, I wanted to ask you from your personal perspective, what type of impact did this global pandemic have on sales organizations?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like such an obvious answer that it's been a tremendously difficult time for a lot of sellers. And the thing that I like to remind people is that it's a difficult time for buyers as well. So people in general, virtual selling did not just appear during pandemic. People sold virtually before that, but it doubled immediately in terms of the volume of virtual selling going on. And so the impact was 80% of the folks that we asked in some research that we did, the impact was negative, just in terms of both the way that people feel and the actual outputs, the way that people are performing. So it's had a negative impact. I think people have been able to get used to things a little bit, but there's a ways to go.
Yep, I 100% agree. I've had a few conversations with different sales trainers or sales professionals talking about how different organizations have approached it in regards to some of them actually have a plan of action on how to roll out an actual effective virtual selling program. And some of them are just like, hey, here are some tools, kind of good luck as you go. And so I think you really spoke to specifically both sides of the equation, this sellers and buyers, but to focus a little bit more on the sellers piece, I wanted to ask you, what are some of the top challenges that you've seen sellers face when they transition from a more in-person type of selling approach to a virtual selling approach?
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, we did research on this. So we talked to lots of sellers, right as the pandemic hit, and then throughout, we've been talking to sellers. That's part of what we do in our organization. And, pretty much unanimous. Sellers are social beings, right? They like being out. They like being on the road to the extent that they get to meet and build relationships with buyers and people who are interested in what they have to say. And so sellers' initial struggle is relationship building, rapport building, and the number one thing is keeping attention. And so you might get a meeting, but think about it. If you're on Zoom, as many have been, or other platforms, and you're in your fifth or sixth meeting of the day, even the best seller who used to be able to command a room is going to struggle to gain attention, keep attention, and of course, get points across. And so the biggest seller complaint, I think, even today is attention, is how to get and keep attention.
So I guess to unpack that a little bit, Dave, obviously you mentioned being in meetings, whether it is from a sales standpoint or just being meetings in general. Obviously we've heard of the, kind of Zoom fatigue or, different video fatigue and different things like that. I wanted to ask you, what have been some practical ways for you to, I guess, re-energize yourself for the next meeting or things like that, as you may, be booked out for a full day of meetings, but finding that momentum, or I guess that motivation to continue to, be as 100% on par as you can.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is about the setup, right? So just thinking and planning in advance about how you're going to run the meeting. So, a lot of people who go into live meetings plan those meetings very well. But planning the meeting around, the interactivity of the meeting, the visuals that you're going to provide, the things that give the buyer energy quite often are not about you, but about how the meeting logistics line up. One of the other research things that we found was that there was quite a bit of technical or visual or graphical interference going on. So from a seller standpoint, sure, there's motivation, but there's also the planning part of it. How's this meeting going to feel? How many people should be at a meeting? The less, the better. And when I plan this, how do I balance out the visual impacts that I can create, the way the lighting looks, the sound sounds? You've got to create and orchestrate an environment for the buyer so that both of you have less fatigue and that the meeting actually gets to the point where you're collaborating with your buyer around what's important.
Yeah, and so to I guess build off of that specifically, you mentioned a few things to keep in mind as far as audio, video. We have lighting and different things like that. I wanted to ask you, what are some of the common mistakes you've seen sales professionals and organizations make when it comes to virtual selling?
Yeah, and I think there's been a bit of a trajectory now in terms of this area. And so some of it is technical, some of it is lighting and sound and background, and no one's perfect. And you work with what you can work with, right? So not everybody has optimal office settings. Distractions are a big part of it. Cats, dogs, babies, lawnmowers, all of that, right? That enters into the fray. But to the extent that some of the biggest things that we found is just even being aware of it, right? Understanding that the angle of your camera, right? The camera looking up, the camera too high, the room too dark, the sound being overmodulated, undermodulated, all of those things, the sum total of that, right? So it could be anything, camera, lighting, sound, background, etc. It's either a detractor or an inhibitor of the way that you're perceived by the buyer, right? It's like if you went into a live meeting and your shirt was buttoned incorrectly and you had a jacket that was rumpled, right? You'd probably notice that stuff on your own before you walked in as a pro. But if you walk into a virtual meeting and you're on mute and you don't know it, and then all of a sudden you're trying to unmute and you're fumbling around and then your camera's cockeyed, all that stuff, again, doesn't seem like a big deal, but think about the buyer who's making judgments around who you are and whether to believe and trust you. So some of the things, we probably don't have time to go into how to fix it, but part of it is just the awareness and the dedication to getting it right.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think that's one of the things I noticed, especially like we were talking before we're officially recording this. Having a musician background, I think I pay attention to a lot of the little things like audio quality and obviously production value. And honestly, I think to I guess build off of one of the things you said, like you may not have a lot of things at your disposal, but there are free and inexpensive ways to actually improve the production value of your of your video conferencing in different aspects. And honestly, like the reason I say that is because I recently saw a video on YouTube of somebody showing how to do that. So I'm sure there's a lot of content out there specifically about that, but we've been focused a little bit obviously initially on the seller side of this conversation. I wanted to switch the focus a little bit more to the buyer side, and my first question specifically in this regard is, what factors have the greatest influence on buyers' purchasing decisions when it comes to buying virtually?
Yeah, and this is one of the things that we cover in the virtual selling book that we wrote a few months back. For buyers, what's really important to them is that there's a good, first of all, rapport matters, relationships matters, those always matter. So nothing's changed in selling in terms of the things that matters around the basic connection points, right? You want to know somebody, you want to trust them, you want to have a relationship, sellers and buyers. We then get into the sales process, the meetings themselves, and the initial discovery and the discovery questions, for some reason, virtually, those tend to not go as well. And so those are impactful for buyers because buyers want to know that you're learning about them so that you can help them to see a new conclusion, solve a problem, deliver insight, whatever value you're going to bring. But that initial discovery for buyers seems to be a problem virtually. And there's ways to overcome that. First of all, using the power of the medium effectively is a great way to do discovery. For example, if you know how to annotate and you know how to whiteboard your way through a discovery session. It will impress the buyer, number one. And number two, it's a great way to change things up in the medium so they're just not only listening to you speak or sort of droning through questions that sound maybe a little bit, generic. And so whiteboarding, annotating, using your slides, using whatever tools you have, that's one thing. Secondly, ROI seemed to be a really big problem for buyers in our research. It actually had the biggest gap between something that buyers covet and sellers do well. And so that gap, that again, ROI, the largest gap. And what I mean by ROI is for the seller to be able to create a compelling case that there's an ROI story that hangs together regarding what it is, the value of what it is that you're selling and what it is that the buyer might realize from an impact standpoint. So building that ROI case, that's something that I would just advise sellers, practice it. And again, use your powers, your slides, your whiteboard, your annotation tools, and make sure that the seller and the buyer co-create that and work on it together, and you'll see better outcomes.
We hope you're enjoying today's episode. Here's a quick shout out to today's sponsor. Intellacall is a video software that connects your customers with anyone in your organization with just one click from your website. But in a world filled with video software, why should you consider Intellacall? I'll tell you why using one word: simplicity. Intellacall allows you to connect via video without downloading any software, sending any meeting IDs, or passwords. On top of that, Intellacall integrates directly onto your website, so if any customers or prospects want to get in contact with you directly, they can do just that. For more information on Intellacall or to schedule a demo, please visit us at www.intellacall.com. And now, back to today's episode. What are your thoughts on meeting length? So let's say traditionally what may have been an hour conversation. Do you think that same hour conversation in person translate the same way online, or do you think it goes down drastically? And if so, how much do you think?
Yeah, so there's sort of two factors there, right? The meeting size and the meeting length, meaning how many people. So meetings degrade over time and with more people, right? There's something called the Ringleman effect, which we talk about in our book, which is the more people that are in a meeting, the more chance for any individual to hide, right? Think about that logically. Mm-hmm. And so if you have 7 people on a 2-hour meeting, inevitably every single one of those people will find a reason to hide because they'll multitask, other things will happen, emails start going. So I would say, yes, slightly shorter meetings, but if, again, you make the meeting interesting, I'd be less concerned about shortening a typical meeting that might be an hour to a half an hour, for example. Like, use your time, but have less people on the meetings, use multiple media opportunities, right? Whiteboarding and video and polls and interactions, and the meeting won't feel so long. So I think it's really more a matter of overcoming it versus shortening it.
Yep. Okay. That's actually a great mindset. And I like you were saying, just strategy and approach to actually engaging your ideal customer. And so, we were able to address the sellers, the buyers, and now I just want to talk a little bit more high level, just from an organizational standpoint. And obviously, Rain Group specifically specializes in helping organizations, implement the right virtual selling programs. But from a high level view, maybe not like because I know every organization is different. How does an organization incorporate an effective selling program in this day and age?
Yeah, so I think, number one is thinking about it from a proactive standpoint, right? So this is something that you have to plan for. Again, the power of good sellers to be magnetic and use their personality and their charisma and the social selling aspect, it can be minimized pretty quickly in an online environment. So you have to plan for ways to build rapport and ways to connect, and ways to grab attention. From a corporate standpoint, from a management standpoint, thinking about it from a training and a management perspective, one of the most important things that's happened and what we find in our research, sellers tell us, is that time is a challenge. Planning and managing your own time is now, think about it. In the past, you had travel, you had, meetings and lunches, and the calendar was a little more sort of flexible. Now you have nothing but you and the computer and time and a list of people to talk to, right? And, I'm being a bit facetious there, but it is a challenge. People need to be motivated. They need to have a cadence. They need to know that there's certain expectations. They also need to, monitor themselves so that they're not doing their most important call or Zoom meeting is the 8th one of the day when they're exhausted. So some of this is about managing time and some of it is about managing performance. And the performance piece, we've talked a little bit about it. Think about it from how do I connect with people? How do I engage with those people? How do I collaborate with them? How do I influence them? There's different categories, and you really want to think about mastering each of those and not giving away anything just because you're working on Zoom.
Yep, and just for the audience to know, I will include in the show notes the actual link to the white paper where Rain Group really breaks down a lot of the research and a lot of that insight that you guys were able to gain, as well as a link to the actual book, the virtual selling book that you co-wrote with Mike Schultz. And so to transition now to more of I guess the technical side of virtual selling, I wanted to ask you, what types of tools and technology should organizations leverage in their selling approach?
Yeah, and we get asked this question a lot because people want the answer, like what's the best camera, what's the best lighting? You don't need the best, right? So the idea that if you had a simple professional mic, an HD camera, a ring light, the whole outfit can be a couple of $100s. Not to say that that's not a lot of money, but this is not a full studio. Setting up your background, using simple things that are behind you, a bookshelf, a chair, just that it's neat and well organized is fine. So no overcomplication here. Simple microphone, pro microphone, $50. There's different brands out there that you can get, Logitech, things like that. Again, so we're somewhat brand agnostic, but our point is that an HD camera that you can clip on your computer if you don't have one, a pro mic that you can plug into the USB, a ring light that you can set up right behind your camera pointed at your face, and a little bit of background for $200. You can be fully set up. And you should focus on all of those things so that you have confidence that you're coming across in a certain way. The other thing that I will say, just in terms of tech, is even the whiteboarding tools and some of the other software that you can use inside of a meeting, just start out with what's available natively within your app, right? Your Zoom whiteboarding feature, sure, there are fancier ones and better ones with more functionality, but again, doing all of these things at a good level, the sum total of that will be tremendous. So that's the advice.
Yeah, awesome. I'm glad you mentioned those pieces about whiteboard. I was actually going to ask you because I've seen both done virtually, but then also two people have a secondary. I had a guest recently on who had a little actual whiteboard set up and was able to transition and toggle between back and forth. But obviously, like your recommendation is, and I guess the approach is, like you said, you're not brand agnostic. You're brand agnostic, meaning like you're not like there isn't something that should pigeonhole you from doing a good job, from having a good setup. It's super doable, super manageable, and so
Yep.
and so before I ask you the final question, Dave, do you have any final thoughts in regards to the topic of virtual selling that maybe we didn't cover in the previous questions?
Yeah, and thanks for that. Yeah, I think in summary, the balance of how to manage this and how to think about it. Again, I want to highlight the proactivity, thinking about your time and how to connect with your audience. There's one that I didn't really get deeply into, which is collaboration. One of the things that's just super important around how to perform in this environment is to have a two-way conversation. And there are ways for your buyer to participate that you may not have thought of. So polls, interactive tools, things like that. If you have a small group, those are great tools, again, natively available. But in a whiteboarding session, make sure it's not just you whiteboarding. Hand control of the screen over to your buyer. Let them do something and give them an opportunity to correct you. So, for example, if I were doing something around discovery and I put together some topics that I wanted to talk about based on some research that I did, I might start out by saying, hey, I came up with these topics and things that we can talk about. How'd I do? And do you want to grab control and just add any of your own? And by doing that and collaborating, you're meeting your buyer halfway. You're giving them something interesting to do. And the energy in the virtual room goes up. So the collaboration piece can't be minimized. And I wanted to make sure I mentioned that.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a really good point. And over over the duration of this conversation, obviously, like all of this contributes to the overall strategy of implementing the effective virtual selling program within your organization. So if people are interested in learning more about you and what you're doing at Rain Group, what are some of the best ways to connect with you, Dave?
Yeah, LinkedIn, that's it for me. Just look at my LinkedIn profile and message me. I'm happy to talk to you further. Go to Rain Group's website. You can get in touch with us through there. And there's plenty of white papers and other really good content on this subject that we've published that you can pull down off the website. But if you want to talk to me, and I'd be happy to talk to you, check out my profile on LinkedIn, D. Shaby at Rain Group.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dave, for coming on the podcast and sharing some insight based off of your personal experience, based off of the research that Rain Group did, and also to some of the insights that you gained in writing the actual virtual selling book with Mike Schultz. And so I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today and sharing some knowledge with our audience.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.